The classroom smelled of dry erase marker and cheap floor wax, and at the front of it, a woman in a pressed lavender cardigan held up a child's drawing the way a person holds up something they intend to throw away. 22 third graders watched her. The boy whose drawing it was sat in the second row with his hands flat on his desk, and he was not breathing right. His name was Eli Vance. He was 8 years old, and the picture in the teacher's manicured fingers showed a man on a motorcycle with a long brown beard and a vest covered in patches. "Class," the teacher said, "this is what happens when nobody at home cares about a real assignment." She let the words settle. She had a way of letting words settle. The boy's ears went red, then his whole face. And somewhere in the back, a kid laughed, because a kid always laughs. And the laugh spread the way fire spreads across spilled gasoline. Eli looked down at the desk and did not cry, which somehow made it worse, because an 8-year-old refusing to cry is the loneliest thing in any room. What the teacher did not know, could not have known, was that the assignment had been draw the person you are proudest of, and that the man on the motorcycle had ridden through 2 states and a cracked engine block to be at that boy's side for the last 4 years. She did not know whose son she was holding up to the room. She would learn. Eli Vance lived with his father in a rented half of a duplex on the eastern edge of a working town in the high desert, where the wind came down off the ridgeline, carrying grit and the smell of creosote. The town was called Mojave Springs, and it was the kind of place that had a feed store, 3 churches, a school, and a bar, with no name on the sign, just a painted silhouette of a wheel. The good half of town had lawns. The other half had gravel yards and trucks on blocks and men who fixed those trucks on Sundays. The boy's father was named Daniel Vance, though almost nobody in his life had called him Daniel since he was younger than Eli was now. They called him Cope, short, for a last name he no longer used, and a temper he no longer had. He was 41, built thick through the shoulders, from 20 years of turning wrenches and lifting things heavier than himself, with a brown beard going gray at the chin and hands that had been broken and reset so many times the knuckles sat crooked. He wore a leather cut, scarred soft with age, and on the back of it was the rocker patch of the Iron Saints, a charter that ran the long, empty highways of 3 counties. He had not always been a good man. He would have been the first to tell you that. There had been years he did not talk about, years with a needle and a county lockup and a woman who left because the man she married had disappeared inside the man he became. But the woman had left Eli behind 4 years ago now in a way more permanent than a door closing. And a man who has lost everything else will sometimes find that the last thing he refuses to lose remakes him entirely. Cope remade himself for the boy. He got clean in a cinder-block clubhouse with 3 brothers sitting up with him through the worst of it, holding him down when he shook, feeding him broth when he could keep nothing else. He took the wrenching job at the diesel shop on the highway. He learned to braid a small girl's hair from a video before he learned it was a boy who needed his shoelaces. Tied, he showed up. Every morning he showed up, and that, in the end, was the whole of his religion. The teacher's name was Miss Prudence Hollows, and she had come to Mojave Springs from somewhere greener 3 years back, with a degree framed on the wall behind her desk, and the particular certainty of a person who has decided what kinds of people exist before she has met any of them. She drove a clean white sedan. She wore cardigans the color of mints, and she had decided on the first day she saw Daniel Vance idling his motorcycle at the curb at 3 o'clock exactly what kind of home that boy went home to. She was wrong about almost everything, but she was confident, and in a small school confidence often passes for authority. The afternoon of the drawing, Eli walked home the long way so his eyes would be dry by the time he reached the duplex. He was good at this. An 8-year-old who has learned to time the drying of his own eyes has already learned more about the world than any child should. He came in the screen door and dropped his backpack, and his father, home early with a sprained wrist wrapped in tape, took one look at him and knew. "What happened?" Cope said. It was not a question the way most people ask questions. It was flatter than that. A foundation being checked for cracks. "Nothing," Eli said. Cope crouched down, slow, his knees popping. He did not touch the boy. He had learned that a cornered thing needs to be approached the way you approach a spooked horse, sideways and patient. "You walked the long way," he said. "Your shoes got the alley dust on them." "Huh?" "You only do that when something's chewing on you." The boy's chin trembled. The dam he had built so carefully on the walk home held for one more second. And then a third grader's grief is not a structure that holds. He told his father everything, the assignment, the drawing, the cardigan and the manicured fingers and the words about nobody at home caring, and the laugh and the long minutes after when he sat with his face on fire and learned a new way to be alone. Cope listened without his face changing, which took everything he had. When the boy was done, his father did something the boy did not expect. He picked up the drawing, which Eli had crumpled into his backpack, and he smoothed it out flat on the kitchen table with the side of his taped hand, slow, like ironing a flag. He looked at it a long time. "This is good work," Cope said quietly. "You got the patches right." That was all he said about the drawing. But that night, after Eli was asleep, Daniel Vance sat at that same kitchen table in the dark, and he did not sleep at all, and what moved through him was not the old fire. The old fire he had buried. This was colder and more patient, and in its way more dangerous, because the old fire burned itself out, and this did not burn. It calculated. He did not go to the school the next morning to shout. A lesser story would have him kicking down a door. Cope had buried that man too. He went to work. He turned wrenches with one good hand and one taped one, and he thought, and on his lunch break he made a single phone call from the gravel lot behind the diesel shop. And the man he called was the president of the Iron Saints, a man the club called Padre. "It's Cope," he said. "I need 10 minutes at church, not club business, my business." There was a pause on the line, the sound of a man who has learned that the things people call not club business are very often the most important club business there is. "Friday," Padre said, after the meeting. "Bring the boy's drawing." Cope had not mentioned a drawing. But Padre had a way of knowing things, the way a man who has spent 30 years listening to other men's silences learns to read what is underneath them. The clubhouse of the Iron Saints sat at the dead end of an industrial road, a low cinder-block building with a steel door and a gravel lot that on Friday nights filled with chrome until the whole yard glittered under the one sodium lamp like a field of coins. Inside it smelled of stale, coffee, engine grease, cigarette smoke gone into the walls over decades, and the particular leather smell of 40 cuts hung on hooks or worn on backs. There was a scarred bar that had come out of a real bar somewhere, a pool table with a tear in the felt, patched with tape, and a long table at the back where the officers sat. Eli had been there before. To him, it was not a frightening place. It was the place where Uncle Tank let him win at pool, and where the woman they called Mama Rose, who ran the kitchen, kept a jar of butterscotch candy with his name on a piece of masking tape stuck to the lid. The men who scared the rest of Mojave Springs were, to one small boy, the safest adults he knew. This is the thing. The Cardigans of the world never understand. They see the leather. They never see the butterscotch. Friday after the meeting, Cope brought the boy and the smoothed-out drawing. Padre took the drawing in two enormous hands and looked at it under the bar light. Padre was 63, heavy-set and barrel-chested, well over 6 feet, with a full gray beard that reached the center of his chest and small wire glasses. He wore low on his nose for close work. On the back of his cut, above the same Iron Saints rocker, was the word Presit, and below it a small stitched cross, which was the only thing left of the seminary he had walked out of 40 years before. He had hands like a man who had built things and broken things and learned eventually the difference. He looked at the drawing a long time. Then he set it on the bar very gently, and he looked at Eli over the wire glasses. "Son," he rumbled, "did you draw this for the assignment?" Eli nodded. "And the assignment was to draw the person you're proudest of?" Eli nodded again. "Then you did the assignment exactly right," Padre said. "And anybody who tells you different is telling you about themselves, not about you. You understand the difference." The boy did not entirely, but he understood that the largest man he had ever met had just told him his drawing was good, and that was enough to hold the cracks together for a while longer. Padre sent the boy to the kitchen to find his butterscotch. When Eli was gone, the president's face changed, the warmth going out of it the way light goes out of a window when someone steps in front of it. He looked at Cope and then at the 3 other men who had stayed at the table. The sergeant. At arms they called Whisper, a younger member named Sketch who never went anywhere without a laptop, and the road captain, a lean gray man named Loomis. "Tell me about her," Padre said. So Cope told them. And here is where a lesser club, a club like the ones the Cardigans imagined, would have decided to go to the school and frighten a woman. The Iron Saints did not do that. Padre had a rule, stitched into 30 years of running men who could have been monsters and chose not to be. We do not raise a hand to anyone who has not raised one first, and we never ever frighten the small. A woman alone in a classroom was to them the small. There would be no headlights in her rear view at midnight. There would be no leather wall at her front door. "We're not going to scare her," Padre said. "Scaring her makes her the story, makes her a martyr at the next teachers' meeting, makes the boy the kid whose biker dad sent the gang. No." He took off the wire glasses and cleaned them on his shirt. "Slow. We find out who she is, then we let who she is do the work." That was the whole of the plan. In that first night, it did not sound like much. It would prove to be everything. Sketch was the one they called the digital ghost, though never to his face, because he hated it. He was 29, narrow and pale from indoor light, with a half sleeve of unfinished tattoos and the patch of a full member earned the year he had unwound a fraud that had nearly cost the club its clubhouse. He did not gather information to hurt people. He gathered it the way a locksmith studies a lock, patiently, with respect for how it was built. Over the next week, in the quiet hours, he learned Prudence Hollows, the way you learn a town by walking every street. He did not break a single law that would have mattered. That was a point of pride with him, and a point of policy with Padre. Everything he found where a determined parent with a library card and a public records portal could have found it, if that parent had known where to look and had a week of patient nights. The difference between the club and that parent was not the legality, it was the patience. What he found, he brought to the long table on a Thursday night Prudence Hollows was 44. She had come to Mojave Springs 3 years before from a wealthier district 200 miles west, and she had not come because she loved the high desert. She had come because she had been quietly asked to leave. There had been a complaint, then several, then a settlement that the prior district had paid to make a problem disappear. The problem had a pattern. She singled out the children of the family she had decided did not matter. The trailer kids and the migrant kids and the kids whose fathers worked with their hands, and she made examples of them. And she did it with a smile and a cardigan. The prior district had buried it. That was the part that made Loomis, the road captain, set his jaw. The settlement was sealed. The reference letter she carried to Mojave Springs was glowing, written by an administrator who wanted her gone and would say anything to move her along. Then, she had been failing upward for 15 years, protected at every step by institutions that found it easier to pass her down the line than to stop her. She had never once faced a consequence. She believed, with the deep, unexamined certainty of someone who has never been told no, that she never would. "So she's done this before," Cope said. "She's done this her whole career," Sketch said. "Eli's not the first. He's just the first one whose dad knows people who keep records." Padre was quiet a long time. The thing about the long table of the Iron Saints was that it was, in its strange way, the only court some of these men had ever trusted. The official courts had failed most of them at least once. Padre had built this table to be the thing the courts were supposed to be and weren't. "Here's what I won't do," he said finally. "I won't put this on the internet. I won't ruin her in a way that ruins 10 other things on the way down. We're not torches. We're not a mob." He laid his crooked hands flat on the table. "But there is one room where what she's done has to be said out loud, in front of the people whose job it was to stop her and made impossible to bury. And that room has a date on the calendar already." The school board of Mojave Springs Unified met on the third Tuesday of every month in the multi-purpose room of the very school where Eli sat in the second row. The meetings were public. Anyone could speak. Almost nobody ever did, because almost nobody believed it would matter, and that disbelief was its own kind of seal on the whole rotten arrangement. The board members were the good half of town. The superintendent was a man named Royce Bellamy, 56, who wore good suits and polished shoes and had perfected the art of looking concerned while changing nothing. It was Bellamy, Sketch found, who had taken the call from the prior district 3 years ago. It was Bellamy who had read the sealed settlement, or known enough about it, and hired Prudence Hollows anyway, because she came cheap and credentialed, and because the high desert is where districts send the teachers nobody else wants, and pretend it is a hiring decision and not a dumping ground. Bellamy was the institution. Hollows was just the instrument. Padre understood that better than anyone because Padre had spent his life watching how power actually worked. And it never worked through the obvious villain. It worked through the comfortable man in the good suit who signed the form and went home to dinner. The week before the meeting, things did not stay quiet, because they never do. A false sense of safety is a fragile illusion, and the boys was about to break. Prudence Hollows had noticed that the Vance boy seemed less afraid of her than a properly shamed child ought to be. She did not like that. So she escalated the way bullies escalate when their cruelty stops producing the flinch they feed on. She moved Eli's desk to the front corner alone, facing the wall, and she told the class it was because he could not be trusted to behave with the others. She wrote a note home in red ink. And on the Friday before the board meeting, She kept him in from recess and told him, in the empty classroom with the door closed, that she had seen boys like him before, and she knew exactly how they turned out, and that no amount of his father's friends in their costumes. She should not have said that, not because of what the club would do, because of what it told them about her. She knew, she had heard, through the small-town way that everything travels, that the boy's father rode with the Iron Saints, and instead of fear, it had produced contempt, and contempt had made her careless. She thought the leather was a costume. She thought the men were a joke. She had decided what kind of people they were before she met any of them, which was the exact thing she had done to every child she ever broke, and it was about to be the thing that finished her. Eli came home that day, and he did not walk the long way. He could not even manage the drying of his own eyes. He came in the screen door already crying, and he told his father what she had said, the part about how he would turn out, and Daniel Vance felt the old fire stir for the first time in 4 years. He did not let it out. That was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than the cinder block room and the broth and the shaking. He held his son, and he let the boy cry himself empty, and over the small, heaving shoulders he stared at the wall, and he breathed in for 4, out for 4, the way the broth men had taught him until the fire banked back down to the cold, patient thing it had to be. Then he called Padre. She kept him in from recess, Cope said, and his voice did something it had not done in years. Told him she knows how boys like him turn out. The line was silent for a long moment. When Padre spoke, his voice had gone very quiet, which from Padre was the most frightening thing in the world. Tuesday, he said. She talks to the small one alone in a locked room. Tuesday, we talk to her in front of everyone. Bring the boy if he'll come. He doesn't have to. But if there's any part of him that wants to see the wall come down, he should be in the room when it does. Eli wanted to come. He said so with a fierceness that startled his father, a flash of the same steel that had let an 8-year-old time the drying of his own eyes. I want her to see you're not a costume, the boy said. He had heard the word through the duplex wall. Cope had not known. There is no privacy in a small house and no secret a child does not eventually carry. The third Tuesday came down off the ridge line with the wind, and at 6 o'clock, the gravel lot of the school began to fill with sound, not chrome at first. Just the ordinary cars of the good half of town, the board members and the handful of parents who came to complain about the lunch menu and the bus routes. Royce Bellamy arrived in his clean sedan and his good suit and shook hands at the door. Prudence Hollows came in a fresh mint cardigan, because she had been told the board wished to commend several teachers that evening, and she assumed, as she assumed everything, that she was among them. The multipurpose room held maybe 120 people. That night it held 80, which for a school board meeting was a crowd, because word had moved the way it moves, and the good half of town had come to see whether the rumor was true that something was going to happen. It was Cope who walked in first, alone in his cut, with Eli's hand in his. The room's noise dropped by half. 80 people had spent 3 years not quite looking at the man who idled his motorcycle at the curb, and now he was inside their lit room, and he was smaller than the legend and more dangerous for it. Because legends you can dismiss, and a calm 41-year-old father in worn leather you cannot. He and the boy sat in the front row. He folded his crooked hands in his lap, and he waited. The meeting ground through its agenda. Bus routes, a budget line, the commendation of 2 teachers for perfect attendance, and Prudence Hollows sat straighter each time, certain her name was next. It was not. When the chairwoman reached the line on the agenda that read public comment, she read it the way you read a formality. and she asked, without expecting an answer, whether anyone wished to address the board. Daniel Vance stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never once raised his voice, and that was the thing people remembered after the way the most frightening man any of them had ever seen used the quietest voice in the room. He gave his name. He said he was the father of a third grader at this school. He said he wanted to read the board something, and then he wanted to ask them a question, and he was going to do both, whether they liked it or not, but he would be polite about it, because his son was watching and he was trying to teach the boy how a man behaves. Then he read. He read the dates. He read the Pryor district, 200 miles west. He read that there had been complaints, then a settlement, then a seal. He did not have the sealed document, and he said so plainly because Sketch had been adamant that they claimed nothing they could not stand behind. But he read the pattern, the names of the kinds of children, the years, the glowing reference letter, and the name of the administrator who had signed it to make a problem go away. He read it flat and slow, and with every line the mint cardigan in the fourth row went a shade paler. And then he turned. Not to her, but to the superintendent in the good suit. "Mr. Bellamy," he said, "you took the call from that district 3 years ago. You knew there was a settlement. You hired her anyway because she was cheap and because you figured out here it wouldn't matter, because out here the kids whose dads work with their hands don't have anybody who keeps records." He let that sit. He had learned from a woman in a lavender cardigan exactly how much a silence could do. You were wrong about the records. You were wrong about who was watching. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the wind against the high windows. Royce Bellamy did what comfortable men in good suits do when the form they signed comes back to find them. He reached for the institution. He said this was not the appropriate venue. He said personnel matters were confidential. He said there were processes, and the gentleman could file a complaint through the proper channel, and the board would of course review it through the appropriate procedure in due course. He used every word the institution had given him to make a thing disappear, the legal and procedural language that was the only language he truly trusted, and for 15 years it had always worked. It did not work, because the room had changed underneath him and he had not felt it shift. The steel doors at the back of the multi-purpose room opened. They did not bang. They opened slow, the way Padre did everything, and through them came the Iron Saints. Not all of them, 11 men in their cuts, and they did not shout, and they did not threaten, and not one of them so much as raised a hand. They simply came in and stood along the back wall, a line of leather and gray beards and crooked hands folded in front of them, and they were silent, and their silence was louder than any voice in the building. Padre came last. He did not go to the front. He stood at the back with his men, a barrel-chested old man with a gray beard to the center of his chest and small wire glasses, and he took those glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt slow and put them back on and looked at Royce Bellamy over the top of them. That was all. That was the entire act of the Iron Saints. That night, they stood against a wall, and they watched. But a room full of the good half of town who had spent 3 years pretending not to see these men now had to sit in a lit room with them and could not look away. And in that forced looking something happened that no headlight in a rear view could have done. The institution's spell broke. The procedure, Bellamy, was reciting, curdled in his mouth. Because procedure works in private, procedure works in the dark, in the sealed settlement, and the glowing letter and the meeting nobody attends. Procedure cannot survive 80 people and 11 silent witnesses all looking at the same comfortable man in the same good suit at the same moment, waiting to see whether he will reach for the truth or for the form. He reached for the form. He always would have. And 80 of his neighbors watched him do it, and the watching was the verdict. It was the chairwoman who broke first, an older woman named Delia who had sat on that board for 19 years and signed her share of forms and had, somewhere in those 19 years, lost track of why she had wanted the seat. She looked at the line of silent men. She looked at the boy in the front row with his small, fierce face. She looked at the pale woman in the mint cardigan and at the superintendent reaching for his procedure, and something in Delia that had been asleep for 19 years woke up. "Royce," she said into the microphone so the whole room heard it, "did you know about the settlement when you hired her? Bellamy said it was not the appropriate venue." "I'm the chair of this board, and I'm asking you on the record," Delia said. "Did you know?" And Royce Bellamy, 56, in his good suit and his polished shoes, with 80 neighbors and 11 silent men and one small boy watching him, opened his mouth to reach one more time for the form that had always saved him. Not because anyone threatened him, because there was no dark left to say it into. Every shield he had ever used required shadow, and the room was all light, and in the light the comfortable man simply came apart. His face went gray. His hands, when he tried to shuffle his papers, would not hold them, and the papers slid off the table and scattered across the floor, and nobody moved to pick them up, and the small sound of those papers hitting the linoleum was the sound of 15 years of institutional armor falling off a man all at once. "I think," Bellamy said finally, in a voice with nothing left in it, "I think I'd like to consult counsel." "I think you'd better," Delia said. Prudence Hollows had not spoken the entire time. She had sat in her fresh cardigan with her certainty draining out of her face minute by minute. And when she understood at last that the commendation had never existed, that she had walked into this room expecting praise and walked into the end of her career instead, she did the thing that her kind always does when the institution that protected them turns to look the other way. She tried to make herself the victim. She stood unsteady and she said in a voice pitched for sympathy that she felt threatened, that there were dangerous men in the room, that she did not feel safe, and she did not see why she should have to defend herself in front of a gang. And here is the moment the whole night had been built toward, though no one had planned it, because the best moments cannot be planned. Padre did not move from the back wall. But he spoke once, and his voice carried the way a low engine carries across an empty desert at night, without effort, filling everything. "Ma'am," he rumbled, "no man here has moved toward you. No man here has raised his voice or his hand. We came in a door, and we stood at a wall." He paused. "You've been alone in a locked room with an 8-year-old, telling him how he'll turn out. We've been standing in a public room in the light, in front of his whole town, not saying a word. I'll let everyone here decide which of those two things they ought to be afraid of." Nobody laughed. It was not a line for laughing. But something moved through the 80 people in that room. A turning, the slow, heavy turning of a town's whole opinion, swinging over like a ship coming about. And Prudence Hollows felt it swing against her, and she sat back down, and she did not say another word, because there was nothing left in the room to protect her, and, for the first time in her life, she understood that the protection had never been hers. It had belonged to the institution. And the institution, in the person of a gray-faced man crawling for his lawyer, had just let her go. The board voted that night to suspend Prudence Hollows pending investigation, and within the month, the seal on the prior settlement, which had survived 3 years and 200 miles, did not survive 80 witnesses and a chairwoman who had remembered her job. It came open. It came open through the proper channels, the official ones, but only because a public room full of light had made it impossible for the proper channels to keep doing what they had always done, which was nothing. Royce Bellamy resigned before the investigation reached him. He kept his pension because comfortable men always keep something, but he never signed another form in that district, and the good suit people noticed did not come around town much. After that, the Iron Saints did not take a victory lap. They did not, in fact, ever go back to the school. Their whole work had taken 11 men, one open door, and the willingness to stand in the light and be looked at, and Padre considered that the cleanest thing the club had done in years, because not one law had been broken, and not one person had been harmed, and a wall had still come down. He said as much. Later, at the long table, cleaning his wire glasses. The trick of it, he said, is they're built for the dark. You don't fight them in the dark. You turn on the lights and you stand still and you let everybody see. But this is not, in the end, a story about a teacher or a superintendent or a sealed settlement. Those are the wall. The story is the boy. Because what Eli Vance saw that night, he saw his father stand up in a room full of people who had spent 3 years looking through him, and give his name and keep his voice low, and refuse to reach for the fire even when the fire would have felt so good. He saw the largest man he had ever met stand against a wall and bring down something powerful without raising a hand. He saw in one lit room the whole of what his father had been trying to teach him with shoelaces and butterscotch, and the long, patient work of showing up every morning. He saw that the leather was not a costume, and it was not a threat. It was a promise. It said, "You are ours, and we do not let the small be broken, and we do not become the thing we fight." A week after the meeting, Eli's teacher was a soft-spoken substitute named Okafor, who on his second day gave the class an assignment to draw the person they were proudest of. Not knowing the history, not knowing he was reopening anything, Eli drew the same drawing. The man on the motorcycle, the long brown beard, the vest covered in patches. He got the patches right. Mr. Okafor held it up to the class, and he said, "Now, this is a person who clearly loves his dad. Eli, you want to tell us about him?" And Eli Vance, 8 years old, who 4 years earlier had learned to time the drying of his own eyes, stood up in front of 22 children in a room that smelled of dry erase marker and cheap floor wax. And he told them about his father. He told them his dad fixed the big trucks on the highway. He told them his dad could braid hair from a video and tie shoes and make broth. He did not tell them about the cinder block room because he did not know about it, and that was a mercy his father had earned for him. He told them his dad's friends had a clubhouse with a butterscotch jar that had his name on it. And then he said, the thing that made the substitute set down his coffee. "My dad says you don't scare people who haven't done anything," Eli said. "He says you stand in the light and you let everybody see. And then you don't have to scare anybody. They scare themselves." The substitute did not have a response prepared for that. Few people would. He said after a moment that it sounded like Eli's father was a wise man. And Eli said, yes, he was, and sat down, and that was the end of it, and no fire in the room at all. That Friday, Cope brought the boy out to the clubhouse for the fish fry Mama Rose put on the last week of every month. The gravel lot filled with chrome until it glittered under the one sodium lamp. Inside, the men ate and argued and lost at pool to an 8-year-old who they all pretended not to let win, and the cinder block walls held the smell of frying fish and old leather and coffee, and it smelled, Eli thought, like the safest place in the world. Padre found the boy near the end of the night by the butterscotch jar, and he crouched down slow, his knees popping the same way the boy's father's did. He took something out of the pocket of his cut. It was a patch, small, hand-stitched by Mama Rose, who did the club's needlework. It did not say anything that would have meant anything to the Cardigans of the world. It was just a small, embroidered set of crossed wrenches, the mark the Iron Saints gave to the children of the family, the ones they had decided were theirs to look after. "Your dad earned his patches," Padre rumbled. "Took him a hard road. This one you didn't have to earn. You were just born ours. You understand the difference now?" And this time, the boy did understand the difference. All of it. And he held the small patch in both hands the way his father had smoothed out the drawing on the kitchen table. Slow, like ironing a flag. Daniel Vance watched from across the room, with his crooked hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and he did not cry either, because the steel in the boy had come from somewhere, and a man does not always need to weep to know that the thing he refused to lose has remade him entirely, and well, and for good. Outside, the wind came down off the ridgeline carrying grit and creosote, and the chrome glittered in the lot, and somewhere down the dark highway a single engine rose and faded, the sound of one of the brothers heading home through the open country, where the law was thin and the code was thick, and a small boy with crossed wrenches in his pocket would never, again, have to walk the long way home to dry his eyes. If this story warmed something in you, if you have ever been the small one in a room full of people who decided who you were before they knew you, stay a moment and let that warmth turn into something. Leave a word below for the people in your own life who stood in the light for you when it would have been easier to look away. And if stories like this one matter to you, follow along, because there are more of them, and every one of them is built on the same quiet idea that the smallest among us are never as alone as the powerful would like them to believe.